Buffy?
Mother.
4 years ago, the great horror YouTuber Ryan Hollinger dropped a video on the Buffy episode he thought was the most frightening, choosing the classic Season 4 episode Hush as the scariest installment. You should check that out. And I think if you were to run a poll of Buffy fans, both casual and hardcore, Hush would probably be far and away the winner. Of course, different episodes resonate with different people for different reasons. Your personal triggers might revolve around the death of a loved one, and so the body or conversations with dead people might have a stronger impact on you. You might have had some serious issues with romantic partners, and so passion or seeing red might hit you differently. You might have a thing about spiders, or snakes, or bunnies.
Bunnies frighten me.
For me, the Season 3 episode entitled Helpless is Buffy at its best, blending metaphor and narrative to create the series' first outright horror episode. And it does so by preying on the audience's sympathy for the characters and the things that are most important to them. Horror was never the first goal of Joss Whedon and his writing staff. His ambition was to deconstruct silly horror tropes, which necessitated setting stories in that world. Along the way, the first 2 seasons became more about the human drama than it did genuine scares, which is probably one of the reasons for the show's continued longevity in the zeitgeist. But that doesn't mean that Buffy can't get freaky with the best of them, and this episode is proof of concept. Taking place in the midst of Buffy's 3rd season and at the show's peak mainstream visibility, Helpless depicts the Cruciamentum, a rite of passage that each Slayer must go through on her 18th birthday, in which she is stripped of her powers and left at the mercy of a vampire. Buffy's vampire, Zachary Kralik, is not only a vampire, but he was a deranged serial killer in his human life, making him doubly dangerous. Without her superpowers, Buffy has to rely on her cunning and creativity to overcome him. Longtime Buffy watchers will notice I left a lot out of that summary, so if you haven't seen it, go watch it. If you're watching it as a horror short film, this is one of the few episodes you can probably jump into and not need a ton of lore or exposition to understand it. For the rest of this, we're hitting the spoiler button and never looking back. But first, I want to know what you think is the scariest episode of the series. Is it Hush? Is it Nightmares? Is it the one where Xander's penis gets syphilis from the Shumash? Drop it in the comments below. Before we begin, I want to back up a moment to talk about why we even seek out horror in the first place. And I'm sure if you're a big horror fan, you already know this, but not everyone does seek it out.
They're all the same. Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
In fact, if you're a big-time horror fan, you've no doubt had the conversation where you had to justify watching something with violence or gore or suspense in it.
You are destroying your life with that garbage!
And unless you've really sat down and had to think about this, your answer was probably something along the lines of, I don't know, I just like it. Which for your own consumption practices should be enough to justify your personal grown-ass decisions. But it's still a good question, and it's one that scholars don't have a definitive answer to. I'm going to TLDR this so that everyone's eyes don't glaze over with psychology and philosophy, and just say that, for scholars, there is a near unexplainable paradox when it comes to media that evokes so-called negative emotions like sadness, anger, and fear. There doesn't seem to be a unifying reason why people seek out art that makes them feel negative emotions. And those decisions go against the usual hedonistic or soul-fulfilling reasons we usually seek out art. And without a single neat explanation for why we use art to make ourselves feel emotions that we would normally try to avoid in real life, scholars and researchers have thrown out half a dozen widely accepted hypotheses. Your mileage may vary as to why you choose to watch scary stories, but for the purposes of looking at Buffy the Vampire Slayer, I'm just going to pick one for you this time out and say that Buffy works for people on the level of power. Just like modern-day superhero movies, Buffy Summers inspires viewers to face problems in their own lives by watching her face down the problems in hers. Seeing characters overcome seemingly insurmountable odds or engage in last-second heroics is why we watch action and drama, and why we root for the underdog in sports. It's why we're relieved by the narrow escape of a final girl. And that's largely what Buffy gives us in the best episodes. There's a clever escape, a creative use of knowledge, or an inspired solution to a problem. And that's what makes her a hero to so many. Helpless is exactly that kind of story. First, the episode deals with Buffy's two greatest fears. The first being the possibility that her position as Slayer could get someone she loves hurt, and the second being paternal abandonment. Being a child of divorce, Buffy relives her father leaving over and over again in different ways throughout the series. In the Season 1 episode Nightmares, where the character's worst fears come true, we learn that Buffy's worst fear is the confirmation that the obligations of being a Slayer, staying out all night, trouble at school, the injuries, are what drove a wedge between her parents and caused them to get divorced. At the time, her parents thought of it as the acting out of a troubled teenager. Buffy's father only appears in a handful of episodes, but his presence is felt throughout most of the first 3 seasons. It's Rupert Giles, Buffy's watcher, who assumes the role of surrogate father, which is what makes Helpless all the more frightening. Also of note, this episode takes place just before Buffy's 18th birthday, which is significant because on Buffy's last birthday she slept with Angel for the first time, an act that led to him losing his soul and becoming the sadistic vampire Angelus. It's safe to say that the writers had already established Buffy's birthday as a somewhat ominous date, where the season storyline can turn on a dime due to tragic consequences. That's why it's significant that Helpless follows Gingerbread, a rare episode where Joyce takes center stage for the stupidest possible version of satanic panic.
Moo just wants to weed out the offensive material.
Intentional or otherwise, running an episode where Joyce stops being a passive observer in Buffy's supernatural life and starts being an active participant right before you hit the pivotal midpoint of the season, where you've historically anchored a game-changing plot point, doesn't necessarily mean that Joyce is getting killed off, but it doesn't not mean that. And with the themes of paternal abandonment and maternal danger bubbling below the surface, writer David Fury masterfully weaves a tale of physical and emotional vulnerability that takes advantage of Sarah Michelle Gellar's incredible capacity for conveying bravery through weakness, and of course her 1,000-yard stares. She's just really good at those. At this point in the series, Angel and Buffy are engaging in a frustrated platonic relationship. Buffy's mom Joyce is aware that Buffy is a Slayer, and she's trying.
I mean, have you tried not being a Slayer?
The second Slayer, Faith, continues to pop in and out with her surplus of personality. Cordelia and Xander's relationship is kaput thanks to Xander's infidelity with Willow. Willow and Oz, however, made amends in the episode Amends. Somewhere, Sunnydale's evil mayor is lurking and preparing his master plan. According to David Fury, the episode is an intentional nod to the Little Red Riding Hood fable, which should be obvious from the numerous references to that story. While the moral of Little Red Riding Hood is to maintain a healthy distrust of strangers, the moral of Helpless is that you can't always trust your allies either. To recap, Buffy and Angel are sublimating their libidos with combat, and it's clear from the tension, and from Buffy's absent-minded fondling of a phallic crystal later on, that it's only barely working. Buffy is also learning mystic crystals, a study session she resents, but Giles assures her is absolutely necessary. Things start to unravel for Buffy as her Slayer powers go all fritzy on her, and her father cancels their big Ice Capades daddy-daughter date. It turns out Giles is responsible for her power loss, which is part of an ancient ritual conducted by the Watchers Council known as the Cruciamentum, in which the Slayer is robbed of her superpowers and left at the mercy of a vampire. In this case, the vampire was a psychotic monster named Kralik in his human life, and becoming a vampire hasn't exactly made him more sane. In fact, the WC has to give him headache pills from a distance, despite the fact that he's strapped in like Hannibal Lecter. Of course, the pills become just the opening Kralik needs to rip through his straitjacket and turn his guard into a vampire. The loss of powers gives Buffy an existential crisis, but then what doesn't give Buffy an existential crisis?
I don't have to be the Slayer. I could be dead. Wouldn't be much of a change. Either way, I'm bored, constricted, I never get to shop, and my hair and fingernails still continue to grow. So, really, when you think about it, what's the diff?
Fortunately, her boyfriend is experimenting with existentialism. Buffy kvetches to Angel about not knowing who she is without her Slayer powers, which is a marked shift from the first 2 seasons in which she fantasized about living a quote-unquote normal life. Now that she has a taste for that experience, she remembers that she doesn't like the person she was very much. Angel tells her the, let's face it, pretty creepy story about stalking her before they ever even met, and falling in love with her from afar. Of course it's mutant enemy, so they undercut it with a joke, but the point was made. Buffy is a person, not the role she plays. We get another little nod to Little Red Riding Hood as Buffy wears a red coat on her way home and is accosted by some creepy guys who catcall her. The real danger is from Kralik and his minion, though. The vampires attack and she very nearly gets killed before Giles arrives to save her. Giles explains the concept of the Cruciamentum and tells her that it's gone off the rails because Kralik is no longer under the Watcher's Council control. He promises to make amends and take care of Kralik and the WC himself, but Kralik targets Joyce instead, kidnapping her and leaving a message for Buffy to meet him at the murder house. Quentin Travers, the head of the Watcher's Council, is decidedly unperturbed by the whole thing. The other Watchers, Buffy's mother, and Buffy herself are acceptable losses in service to the ritual. The Watchers, it seems, are every bit as beholden to tradition as the village in the lottery, and they really have no incentive toward responsibility since another Slayer will be called if Buffy dies anyway. Buffy arrives to save her mother, but Kralik is a special kind of evil, enjoying the pain of the crucifix and trapping her in a basement full of Polaroids of her kidnapped mother. Buffy steals Kralik's pills, forcing him to give chase, but he catches up with her and gulps them down to ease the pain. Unfortunately for Kralik, Buffy outsmarted him, swapping his water for holy water, which burns him up from the inside. Giles saves Buffy from a second vampire, somewhat redeeming himself, but all is not forgiven as Giles is fired from his position as Watcher at the end of the episode. Okay, so just what is it that makes Helpless so unnerving? For starters, I think part of it is that the episode runs so counter to the show's premise. Joss Whedon famously stated that the whole point of Buffy was that he was tired of seeing the ditzy blonde girl chased down the dark alley by a killer. And in this episode, Buffy is a blonde who labels herself ditzy and is chased down the dark alley by a killer. It's an interesting element given that we rarely see Buffy as physically vulnerable. Emotionally vulnerable all the time, sure, but she's generally able to hold her own against even the most vicious demons. The apprehension we feel is compounded by just how brutal Kralik is.
Shh. Everything's okay now.
Much of that is due to Jeff Kober's gleeful performance, which was so strong Mutant Enemy brought him back for season 6 as a different character. Kralik has a sort of playful menace to him, but not so playful that he tips over into being charismatic like Spike or the Mayor. No, Kralik is a monster and is seen as such throughout. He's the big bad wolf of the fairy tale.
Why did you come to the dark of the woods? To bring all these sweets to Grandmother's house.
This isn't nearly as frightening if your only experience with the tale of Little Red Riding Hood is from Looney Tunes or Reese Witherspoon movies. But if you, like many of the Buffy writers, know the original lore, it becomes more harrowing. In the original European folktale, the antagonist of Little Red Riding Hood, or the Grandmother's Tale as it was known, is the Bazoo. The Bazoo, according to lore, is a half-man, half-wolf creature who is different from our modern-day conception of the werewolf in a few fundamental ways. Number 1, he's never fully wolf, nor fully man. Number 2, he can be incredibly charming. Number 3, he's not guided by the full moon. And number 4, what he is guided by is some form of unsated lust. Lust in this case being anything from ravenous gluttony to, well, lust. The Bazoo can only be returned to human form once the lust is satisfied.
I believe the subtext here is rapidly becoming text.
So if there's a sort of sexual undercurrent to this wolfish man on the prowl in some versions of the story, when you add the sexuality of vampirism on top of that, it's not hard to feel another very different kind of danger lurking in the dark woods. The important thing about acknowledging the history, I think, is that in most classic versions of the story, the grandmother character is devoured. If you've seen the episode before, and you should because I gave you a freaking spoiler warning several minutes ago, it's hard to displace yourself and think of Joyce as being in any kind of real danger. We know Joyce's fate. But running it back to 1999, we still had no idea where this was going, and we had every indication what these writers were capable of. Even Kralik's plan to turn Buffy and have her feed on Joyce has roots in Little Red Riding Hood. In the original tale, the Bazoo tricks the protagonist into eating a sausage made out of her grandmother's blood and flesh. Being a one-off villain is also to Kralik's benefit. We get only the backstory on him that we need, and there are some important aspects left to implication. One is that Kralik was a serial killer of women in his human life. He was already a monster before he became a vampire. Now he's just stronger and more vicious. The second is the implication that his abusive mother castrated him when he was a little boy, which is part of what led to Kralik's unhinged violence.
10 years old, she had the scissors. You wouldn't believe what she did with those.
If the Mutant Enemy writers live by a code with their metaphors, it's this: always be connecting. Maybe it's an accident that the episode opens with Buffy and Angel being particularly hot for one another at this point, and being unable to act on it for fear of unleashing the playful, malicious vampire Angelus, who targets those closest to Buffy. You might get where I'm going with this. Kralik is Angelus dialed up to 11, only without Angel's charm or wit. Angelus targets Buffy's mom with psychological tricks that taunt Buffy. Kralik targets Buffy's mom by literally kidnapping her and using her to taunt Buffy. Angelus is playful about his kills, and so is Kralik. Angel has been metaphorically castrated by the magical curse, and Kralik has been literally castrated by his mother. Kralik, in other words, is an exaggerated version of everything Buffy and Angel are afraid will happen if they sleep together again. It's what makes him the perfect foil for the Cruciamentum. The term Cruciamentum, by the way, has its roots in two Latin terms, the prefix crucia meaning torture, and the suffix mentum meaning a tool or instrument. And there is zero chance that the little Lord Fauntleroy Philharmonic doesn't know this. So the Watchers Council is acutely aware that the Cruciamentum is more about pain than testing character. And they continue to do it because...
But it's been done this way for a dozen centuries.
In other words, the cruelty is the point. That at least is the hypothesis of Mark Field, author of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Myth, Metaphor, and Morality. Field suggests that the Cruciamentum is about the Watchers Council exercising control over the Slayer. Providence may have given her power, but the Council is demonstrating to her that they can take it away. It's also a way of reminding her that she is a tool of the Council, not an independent agent.
Congratulations, you passed.
Deep down, what is at the root of it, though, is the emotional and psychological manipulation. Find any organization that is toxic at the top, whether it's a corporation or a family, and you'll find some members who are proud of how long they can withstand the shock collar. And they'll focus that pride and underlying rage on those who say that they should just take off the collar. That's why Harris Yulun's condescending praise for Buffy's cunning in overcoming Kralik rings so hollow. Buffy is not a person to him. She's a supremely expendable tool. Had she and her mother died in the Cruciamentum, another Slayer would have been called. That the Council enacts the Cruciamentum through Giles, Buffy's surrogate father figure, is the most painful part of the ordeal, for both of them. We find out in Nightmares that Giles' worst fear is being responsible for Buffy's death, and that one of Buffy's worst nightmares is becoming a vampire. Both things that Kralik promises here. And that's why this episode is so tense. Buffy isn't just the final girl of a random horror movie you found on the video shelf. We've been with her for 2.5 seasons, and no one can play wounded like Sarah Michelle Gellar. But for the people who watch horror in order to feel empowered, Buffy at its best is about triumph, not tragedy. So when we see her overcoming Kralik with cleverness, it's a revealing moment about her character, and a cathartic moment for the viewer.
If I was at full Slayer power, I'd be punning right about now.
A good horror story will reveal aspects of a character they never knew they had, a well of deeper strength or cunning, and even the capacity for empathy that stems not from obligation, but from love.